Hey, did you know that more than 90% of our viewers listen every night but haven't subscribed yet? If you enjoy these gangster sleep stories, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. It's completely free and helps us keep these underworld tales alive. Now, get comfortable, unwind, and drift into tonight's story. The night settles over the silent empires, where danger moves quietly and the sharpest players speak in whispers, not shouts. Tonight, we turn to Eddie Nash, the enigmatic nightclub kingpin whose wealth, influence, and icy calm made him a silent force behind some of Los Angeles' darkest corridors. His rise wasn't built on noise, but on doors opened with a nod, alliances sealed with a glance, and a quiet power that stretched far beyond neon lights and velvet ropes. Before we begin, tap that like button. We're aiming for 100 likes tonight, and share your city and the time you're listening in the comments. Your support keeps these whispered stories alive in the stillness of the night. Now lean back, breathe slow, and let the story of Eddie Nash guide you deeper into the quiet. Imagine an old man sitting alone in a dim living room in Los Angeles, long after the noise and glare of his clubs have vanished. On the table in front of him lie yellowed photographs, young musicians laughing in bright stage lights, crowds pressing around velvet ropes, his own face smiling in dark suits beside famous faces. If you walked past his small house, you would never suspect that this quiet figure once held the keys to a hidden kingdom, that behind his calm eyes lived memories of secret deals, long nights, and choices that could never be undone. Police reports, whispered stories in Hollywood bars, and court transcripts would one day circle his name. But inside his own mind, he was still the boy who arrived here with almost nothing, determined to win everything. This is the life of Eddie Nash, a man who helped shape the wild nights of Los Angeles, then watched that world turn against him, step by careful step. Before anyone in California ever heard the name Eddie Nash, there was a child called Adel Garib Nasrallah, born in 1,929 inches, what was then Palestine. His family belonged to a Christian minority, living in a region already filled with tension and uncertainty. Stories of conflict and change passed through his home like restless wind. His parents wanted safety and stability, but the land around them seemed to teeter on the edge of something they could not control. As a boy, Adel grew up listening to grown-ups argue in hushed voices about politics, borders, and opportunities disappearing. He felt early that the place he was born might never offer him the future he imagined. From an early age, he showed a restless drive. He watched merchants haggle in crowded markets, saw how a sharp eye and quick tongue could turn a small stall into a solid income. While other children played, he studied the way adults counted money, how they charmed customers, how they stretched a single coin into many. He noticed, too, that rules often shifted, depending on who was watching. Some traders found ways around regulations, cutting quiet side deals, learning when to cooperate and when to push. Without calling it by any name, Adel absorbed a lesson. In a world where power and rules kept changing, survival belonged to those willing to bend without breaking. As he grew older, the region's struggles deepened. Borders were redrawn, communities were uprooted, and rumors of violence became real events. He saw people he knew pack their belongings overnight and leave, not knowing where they would land. The young man who would become Eddie Nash looked around him and decided that his future could not stay there. Like many from troubled places, he turned his imagination toward a distant dreamland he knew only from movies and stories, America. Especially one shining city he had seen on film posters, Los Angeles, the home of studios, palm trees, and dazzling impossible luck. The path to the United States was not simple. Paperwork, visas, and uncertain travel stood between him and the life he pictured. Still, he persisted, pushing through each delay with quiet determination. When he finally reached American soil in the 1,950 seconds, he was a thin young immigrant with very little money, a thick accent, and no guarantees. The streets did not roll out a red carpet for him. He took whatever work he could find, cleaning, lifting, standing long hours for low pay. He learned English one phrase at a time, absorbing conversation from customers, co-workers, and late-night radio. Yet even during these humble beginnings, his instincts never slept. He felt the rhythm of Los Angeles, especially around Hollywood Boulevard. He noticed the constant stream of tourists, actors, dreamers, and drifters moving through certain corners of the city. People came to that strip chasing chances, and they spent money while they waited for their big breaks. Adel, who would gradually start using the more American name Eddie, realized that anyone who could feed, entertain, or comfort those hopeful crowds could build a fortune out of their restless energy. His first step up came in the simplest form, a small food business. He opened a modest hot dog stand near the heart of Hollywood. It was not glamorous. He stood over the grill for long hours, breathing smoke and listening to the constant hum of traffic. But he was his own boss, and that mattered. On good nights, tourists and locals lined up. He learned how to read a face in seconds, which customers would be friendly, which might cause problems, who could be persuaded to buy more. He cracked jokes in slightly broken English, moved quickly, and stayed open late. The stand's earnings might have seemed minor, but to him, they were proof that he could create something from almost nothing. This stand became more than a place to sell food. It became his classroom. From that little corner, he watched the nightlife swirl around him, limousines pulling up to clubs, young people stumbling out of bars, police cruisers gliding slowly along the curb. He saw nervous aspiring actors, confident hustlers, tired bartenders, and wide-eyed tourists. He listened to bits of gossip: who owned which bar, who paid off whom, which club was rising, which was falling. Piece by piece, he began to see how the whole nightlife ecosystem fit together. Owners made deals with landlords, security workers formed friendships with certain officers, and in the shadows of this network, other arrangements existed that no one discussed too loudly. Eddie realized that selling hot dogs was a start, but the real money flowed inside the buildings where the music pounded and lights flashed. He began dreaming of his own place. It would be more than a snack stand. It would be a stage where he controlled the sound, the door, the cash register, and most importantly, the atmosphere. But dreams cost money. To move forward, he needed capital. So he worked harder, skimped on personal comforts, and put nearly everything he earned back into his ambitions. He also started gambling, not just at cards or back rooms, but in life itself, taking small risks that sometimes paid off, sometimes didn't. Stories from those early days suggest that even before he owned his first full restaurant, Eddie was already learning to step over lines. Some former associates later claimed that he occasionally ran side deals for people lingering around his stand, or that he quietly connected certain customers with things they were not supposed to buy so easily. Such claims are hard to prove now, yet what is clear is that he steadily moved from a simple food vendor into someone comfortable dealing with a more colorful mixture of characters: small-time hustlers, minor entertainers, people who walked close to the edge of legality. He learned how to protect himself with charm, favors, and when necessary, a cold stare that said he was not to be taken lightly. With enough savings and some borrowed funds, he eventually opened a proper restaurant. It was not yet one of the legendary clubs, but it marked a turning point. Inside those walls, he began exercising his taste for control. He chose the music, the menu, the look of the room. He watched which dishes sold best, what made customers return, and, importantly, which visitors had influence. Local officials, off-duty officers, neighborhood businessmen. He tried to make them feel welcome. If they felt comfortable under his roof, they might be slower to question how he ran things later. In that era, Los Angeles nightlife was still rough around the edges. Licensing rules existed, but enforcement often depended on who knew whom. Some nights, businesses stayed open longer than allowed. Sometimes drinks flowed when they should not have. Owners who wanted to thrive learned how to navigate this flexible reality. Eddie followed that pattern. Interviews and later court documents suggested that from early on, he was willing to bend regulations, serving alcohol after hours, overlooking certain activities in dark corners, and occasionally handing out discreet sums of cash to keep inspectors or officers satisfied became part of the whispered portrait around him. None of this made headlines at the time, but each decision helped shape his path from legitimate businessman into a figure operating in a grayer, more dangerous zone. Through trial and error, he discovered that nightlife wasn't just about food and music. It was about offering people an escape. To do that, he needed to give them what they craved: attention, excitement, and sometimes illegal thrills. As the 1,960 seconds and 1,970 seconds arrived, youth culture exploded. Bands grew louder, fashions more daring, nights longer. Eddie saw that ordinary restaurants would not be enough. He began opening clubs, each larger and more ambitious than the last. Places like the Starwood and the Kit Kat became magnets for musicians, actors, and rebellious youth. They played rock music at high volume, and stories spread that anything could happen inside their walls. Behind the scenes, his operations became more complex. He employed doormen, bartenders, security staff, and managers, weaving them into a chain of loyalty that centered on him. At the same time, he drew interest from people involved in more serious wrongdoing. Clubs are natural meeting points for those who move illegal substances, and according to testimony from former associates, Eddie did far more than simply rent them space. Over time, prosecutors would allege that he profited heavily from the distribution of illegal drugs in and around his establishments, turning his venues into hubs for transactions that brought in enormous, untaxed income. Exactly when he crossed the line from looking the other way to actively supporting these trades is hard to pinpoint. But by the height of his success, law enforcement considered him more than just a flamboyant businessman. He built secret stashes, used trusted intermediaries, and kept substantial quantities of illegal substances accessible to those in his inner circle. His home was sometimes described in court as a base for storing and selling drugs to favored clients, including entertainers and people tied to adult film and biker subcultures. Every step deeper into that world meant higher profits, but also higher stakes if something went wrong. With money pouring in, Eddie purchased houses, cars, and more businesses. He cultivated an image of a generous, commanding host, a man who could make problems vanish with a word or a favor. Yet the same traits that made him powerful also drew dangerous attention. Rivals watched his profits, police kept files on him, and desperate people began to see his wealth as a tempting target. His willingness to bend rules, to bribe, to threaten when necessary, created a life built on unstable ground. By the late 1972, Eddie Nash stood as one of the most influential nightclub owners in Los Angeles, a man whose phone calls reached into police stations, courthouses, and recording studios. Beneath the neon glow, however, pressure was building. Friends from the early days drifted away or fell into addiction. Some employees feared him, others adored him, many simply needed him. Agents and officers quietly collected information, building cases that would one day surface. On certain nights, when the music finally faded and his guests went home, he was left alone with his thoughts, knowing that the same empire that brought him wealth might one day demand a terrible price. By the time his hair had begun to gray at the temples, the immigrant who once sold cheap food from a sidewalk stand controlled a small chain of night spots across Los Angeles. Street kids, young musicians, and curious tourists knew his places by their glowing signs and loudspeakers. Inside, the air seemed to vibrate with guitar riffs and steady bass lines. Members of bands who would later become famous stomped across his stages, watched by crowds that filled every corner. When they walked off, they often ended up in his office, sweaty and excited, hoping he would book them again. He liked that walk from the stage door to his desk. It reminded him that he held power over more than just money. He could decide whose music got heard, which performers might be noticed by a talent scout, and which group would be turned away because they did not fit the sound he wanted. Sitting behind a desk piled with ledgers and thick packs of cash, he listened to rough demos on cheap cassette players, tapping his fingers while the hopeful musicians waited for his verdict. The teenagers who lined up outside his clubs only saw the surface. The bouncers, the velvet ropes, the neon letters spelling out catchy names. They didn't see the webs of favors, payments, and quiet understandings that kept those doors open. In city files, his businesses were listed like any other venues. On paper, they served food and drinks, charged cover fees, and closed at the hours set by local law. In practice, many former employees later said that last call sometimes came late, that unofficial side rooms existed for special guests, and that profits didn't always match what appeared on tax forms. Rumors began to circle that drugs passed freely in corners and back rooms, that people who came with enough cash could get more than just a drink. Some said he allowed independent dealers to work the crowd for a cut. Others claimed he ran the trade directly through trusted workers. Federal agents and city officers heard these stories and tried to figure out where truth ended and exaggeration began. What they did agree on was that his clubs had become central gathering points for people drawn to fast nights, and that illegal substances were part of the scene. In those years, cocaine became the status drug of choice in Hollywood. For many, it felt like a shortcut to the bright, restless energy the city demanded. Partygoers whispered that Eddie's properties were rich hunting grounds if you knew who to ask. Later, court records painted him as a distributor who used his clubs and home as places to store and sell large quantities. Associates who turned witnesses said that packed plastic bags sat in hidden compartments, that deliveries rolled in and out with careful timing, that money from those sales flowed into a wide network of accounts and investments. At the same time, he tried to maintain an image as a host more than a user. While others partied hard, he often stayed relatively clear-headed, watching the flow of people like a chess player studying the board. He wore gold jewelry, neat shirts, and favored a controlled, even tone when he spoke. Guests might remember him as generous, sending free food or drinks, or paying the tab of a struggling musician. Yet those who worked closely with him described another side. A man quick to anger when he felt cheated, who could freeze a room with a quiet threat, who believed fear was as useful a tool as friendly charm. To keep such an operation running, he needed more than bartenders and booking agents. He needed information and protection. Over time, according to media investigations and testimony in later trials, he forged ties with certain members of law enforcement. The stories varied. Some spoke of envelopes handed over in parking lots, others of free meals, campaign contributions, or jobs arranged for relatives. Whatever the exact form, many believed he had enough influence to soften inspections, gain early warnings about raids, or make certain complaints disappear. That reputation, whether fully earned or partly exaggerated, fed into his myth. In the crowded, gossip-driven world of Hollywood, people said he could pick up a phone and reach officers, politicians, or union bosses. Some of it was likely boastful talk meant to keep adversaries cautious. But even the suggestion that he had such reach served as a kind of invisible armor. Few wanted to cross a man who might be able to retaliate using both street muscle and official channels. Still, that kind of life always carries cracks. In the late 1970s, police attention on organized drug trade increased. Raids on various homes and small dealers produced names and phone numbers. Under pressure, arrested middlemen sometimes revealed where they got their supply. Eddie's name and the addresses of his clubs began appearing more often in case files. A picture developed of a man who wasn't just tolerating drug sales near his dance floors, but actively making them part of his business model. Even without those law enforcement concerns, the world around him was shifting. The rock scene grew darker. Addiction took hold of many who had once only dabbled. Some regulars at his clubs went from eager fans to gaunt figures, chasing another rush instead of another song. Gangs and biker groups hung around certain venues, mixing with musicians and adult film actors in a blur of leather, denim, and worn velvet chairs. His venues became crossroads for different underground communities, bringing variety and danger. Into this world stepped John Holmes, one of the most recognized male performers in adult films of that era. For years, Holmes had been celebrated in that industry, appearing in countless productions. By the late 1970s, however, he was sliding into serious addiction and money trouble. The work slowed, his health declined, and he struggled to maintain the image that had once made him marketable. To feed his habit, he borrowed, begged, and took up dubious side jobs. Holmes and Eddie met through that nightlife network. Accounts differ on who introduced whom, but once their paths crossed, they quickly recognized possible uses for each other. For Eddie, Holmes offered access to yet another circle of Hollywood. Actors, producers, and hangers-on in the adult entertainment business, many of whom also use drugs. For Holmes, Eddie represented a source of high-quality product and a powerful patron whose approval still carried weight in certain rooms. Over time, their connection deepened, though it was never a friendship in any wholesome sense. Holmes came to Eddie's home, a property on a hillside street where he kept expensive furnishings, art, and large stashes of both cash and illegal substances. Guests recalled rooms filled with heavy furniture, thick curtains, and a lingering smell of smoke. Bodyguards moved through the hallways. One of them, a man named Greg Dials, served as Eddie's enforcer and driver, standing watchful while deals went on around him. Holmes often left that house carrying drugs on credit, planning to sell them to his contacts and repay Eddie later. As his addiction worsened, his debts ballooned. Each time he fell behind, he tried to talk his way out with charm, promises, or excuses. At some point, even Eddie's patience thinned. Collectors visited Holmes, pressure increased, and the performer's life grew more desperate. He spent time at a townhouse on Wonderland Avenue in Laurel Canyon, where a small group of petty criminals, drug users, and dealers lived and operated. This crew, often called the Wonderland Gang, bought and sold stolen goods and narcotics, living from score to score. The Wonderland group knew of Eddie by reputation. They heard about his wealth, his home, and the substances he allegedly kept on hand. To them, he looked like a tempting mark, a man with great resources who, in their eyes, might be vulnerable if caught at the right moment. Holmes, weighed down by his debts and eager to improve his standing with them, began talking about Eddie's layout, the routines in his home, how many people were usually inside, where valuables might be stored. What happened next would echo through Los Angeles crime history for decades. According to later police findings and court accounts, the Wonderland crew, with Holmes involved as an informant and guide, planned a robbery at Eddie's residence. They believed that, with surprise and force, they could strip the house of money, jewelry, and drugs, then disappear into the city's back alleys and motels before Eddie could strike back. On a summer morning in 1981, several men broke into the Doheny Drive home while Eddie and his bodyguard were present. They were armed. Holmes played a complicated role. Various accounts disagree on whether he stayed outside, participated directly, or arrived afterward. But detectives and prosecutors later concluded that he had helped set the stage. Once inside, the intruders subdued Eddie and Dials, beating and threatening them to force them to reveal where valuables were kept. Later reports described Eddie being injured, frightened, and humiliated in his own house. The robbers left with a haul that included large sums of money, jewelry, valuable collectibles, and a significant quantity of illegal substances. The exact amounts have never been fully verified, but all sources agree it was an enormous loss. For a man who measured his worth in control as much as in dollars, the theft cut deeply. Not only had he been robbed, he had been attacked in a space he considered secure, by people he had not seen coming. In the hours after the robbery, stories say he paced his home in rage and shock. Longtime associates later recalled that he felt something deeper than anger. He felt exposed. If word spread that he could be robbed so brazenly, others might try. His entire image as an untouchable figure would crumble. He suspected, almost immediately, that Holmes had betrayed him. The performer's debts, his knowledge of the house layout, and his recent behavior all pointed in that direction. Holmes, for his part, seemed shaken after the event. Witnesses recounted that he appeared scattered and anxious, sometimes boasting about the score to some people and shrinking in fear around others. At some point soon after the robbery, he returned to Eddie's house. Accounts differ on whether he came because he was dragged there, because he was trying to smooth things over, or because he had nowhere else to turn. However it happened, he ended up facing the very man whose home had been ransacked. What occurred inside that house in the hours that followed would later be at the center of many courtroom debates. According to law enforcement summaries and witness testimony, Eddie pressured Holmes to reveal who had carried out the robbery. Detectives who later interviewed participants said Holmes eventually cooperated, whether through fear, physical coercion, or a mix of both. At some point, Eddie is said to have learned that the Wonderland Gang was responsible, that they had used Holmes's information and possibly a key he had taken from the home. Within 2 days of the robbery, a separate, horrifying crime unfolded at the Wonderland Avenue townhouse. Intruders entered the residence and brutally attacked those inside. 4 people were killed, and 1 woman survived despite severe injuries. Police who arrived described a chaotic, bloody scene. The killings quickly became known in the media as the Wonderland murders, one of the most notorious multiple homicides in Los Angeles at that time. News reporters fixated on the mix of drugs, adult film connections, and underworld grudges that seemed to surround the case. From the beginning, suspicion turned toward Eddie and his circle. Detectives reasoned that whoever had been behind the retaliation must have known about the Doheny Drive robbery and the Wonderland group's involvement. Holmes's bloody handprint at the murder site tied him unmistakably to the scene. He was arrested and charged, and his trial became a spectacle. Prosecutors painted him as a key player in the revenge attack, claiming he had been present during the killings or helped plan them. Holmes's defense argued that he had been forced to cooperate out of fear, that he had walked into the house after the violence, and that more powerful figures were responsible. Eddie at that early stage managed to stay just outside the courtroom spotlight. He was known to investigators as a possible architect of the revenge, but building a direct case against him proved difficult. Witnesses were terrified, unreliable, or deeply compromised by their own involvement in crime and drug use. Some told one story one year and another version later. The survivor from the Wonderland house could offer limited information about who had carried out the attack. The trail seemed to wind through a fog of half-truths, missing pieces, and silent fear. Still, among officers working narcotics and homicide, few doubted that Eddie had reason and capacity to answer the robbery with force. Years later, when more evidence trickled out in different cases, the picture they had in mind was of a man who could not tolerate being made to look weak, and who had at his disposal people willing to commit serious acts of violence on his behalf. Whether he personally ordered the killings, or simply allowed anger and suggestion to move others, remained a matter of legal argument and public fascination. Holmes went on trial first. After a widely covered proceeding, a jury found him not guilty of the murders, though the verdict did little to clear the cloud hanging over his role. His life continued on a downward path, his health failing, his career long gone. As for Eddie, he returned to his businesses and home life, operating under increased scrutiny. Newspapers wrote about him more openly now, linking his name to the Wonderland case even when official charges had not yet landed on his shoulders. Behind closed doors, investigators kept working, building files not only on the murders but also on Eddie's broader drug activities, his relationships with corrupt officials, and his methods of shielding his assets. While the club still opened each night and the music still thumped, a different kind of rhythm beat in the background, the slow, patient ticking of law enforcement efforts closing in. In the months after the Wonderland killings, it seemed from the outside as if life around him went on almost as before. Cars still pulled up outside his venues, sound systems still shook the walls, and bartenders still counted tips at closing time. Yet under the surface, everything had changed. Detectives who had once looked at him mainly as a nightclub boss now saw him as someone possibly tied to one of the most shocking homicide cases in the city. Officers questioned him repeatedly about the robbery at his home and the revenge attack that followed. He appeared with lawyers, answered some questions, refused others, and denied ordering anyone's death. He admitted he had been robbed and beaten, but insisted he did not know who had gone to Wonderland Avenue 2 days later. When pressed about his dealings with John Holmes, he tried to minimize the connection, describing him as just another acquaintance drifting through the nightlife world. Investigators didn't believe he was that distant. They had the performer's bloody handprint at the crime scene, statements from frightened witnesses, and a sense that the robbery and the killings were two sides of the same story. Still, they lacked a simple, clean link tying the club owner to the attackers. No one had recorded phone calls, no one had seen him at the townhouse, and those closest to him were either too loyal, too scared, or too compromised by their own crimes to testify clearly. Even so, the case changed his daily existence. Search warrants led officers back to his Doheny Drive home. They went through closets, drawers, safes, and hidden spaces, looking for weapons, drugs, and records. Reports from that time describe large quantities of cocaine, cash, and firearms being seized from various properties linked to him. Each raid drew more attention to his name. He was no longer just a colorful businessman running loud clubs. He now appeared in newspapers as a suspected drug kingpin with possible ties to a notorious multiple killing. He responded the way he always had, by using money, lawyers, and influence. Skilled defense teams challenged the legality of searches, questioned the credibility of informants, and fought to suppress evidence. Some charges brought against him in the early 1982 ended in acquittals or dismissals. Other cases resulted in relatively minor convictions compared with what investigators believed he had been doing. To frustrated detectives, it felt as though they were dragging him into court again and again, only to see him slip away through some gap in procedure or some hesitating witness. Those failures helped build his legend in certain circles. People whispered that he was untouchable, that he had friends in high places. Years later, in separate proceedings, prosecutors would allege that he had indeed paid off at least one member of law enforcement to gain information about upcoming raids and investigations. Journalists dug into records and reported on his donations to political campaigns, his habit of hosting favored visitors with free meals and drinks, and his long-standing relationships with officials who could make life easier for business owners. At the same time, his personal world was far from secure. The robbery at his home had left him shaken and angry. The killings, regardless of what he knew or didn't know beforehand, brought a darker spotlight onto his name. People he had once trusted became potential liabilities. Some associates sank deeper into addiction. Others vanished. A few turned informant. A life lived among hustlers and users started to feel as though it rested on thin ice. His own health was changing too. In his younger days, he could work all night, smoke endlessly, and still show up the next evening ready to greet crowds. As the 1,980 seconds moved on, that energy faded. Years of hard living, stress, and rumored heavy drug use began to show. He gained weight, developed breathing problems, and sometimes needed oxygen support. Those who visited him in later years remembered an older man who still tried to project authority, but whose body struggled to keep up with his will. Meanwhile, his empire was shrinking. Some of his clubs closed after losing licenses or running into financial trouble. Changing musical tastes and competition from newer, trendier venues also hurt business. The rock scene that had made his places famous splintered into different directions, and the punk and metal kids who had once filled his rooms aged out or moved on. New owners with cleaner images and friendlier reputations began to dominate certain parts of the city's nightlife. For all that, he was still wealthier than most people could dream of. Years of cash profits had been poured into real estate. He owned apartment buildings, commercial properties, and homes. Rent checks now replaced some of the door fees and drink sales. Instead of pacing club floors, he spent more time in living rooms and offices, watching television or talking with a smaller circle of visitors. The loud, crowded rooms of his prime years became memories on aging photographs. Law enforcement didn't forget him, though. Throughout the mid-1,980 seconds, agencies at the local, state, and federal levels continued to study his operations. They looked at bank records, property transfers, and tax filings. They interviewed former employees who had been fired or felt betrayed. A few of those people, facing charges of their own, agreed to talk in exchange for lighter treatment. Bit by bit, a clearer picture formed of how his clubs had functioned as distribution points for cocaine, how cash was moved, and how he allegedly kept some officials cooperative. Pressure increased again late in that decade. Multi-agency task forces focused on organized drug trade considered him a top target. Another sweeping raid hit his home and connected businesses, this time with more careful paperwork behind it. Prosecutors assembled broader cases, including narcotics counts, weapons violations, and allegations related to his role as a ringleader, rather than just a venue owner who looked the other way. Even so, the shadow of Wonderland never faded. Newspapers occasionally revived the story, especially when John Holmes's health collapsed, and he died in 1988. Articles described how the once famous performer had ended his days, sick and broke, still dogged by questions about his part in the 1981 killings. Those same articles usually mentioned the club owner whose home had been robbed, the man widely rumored to have ordered payback but never convicted. Inside police files, the picture was more direct. Detectives believed, based on interviews, that after the robbery, he had forced Holmes to identify the intruders, then authorized a group of men to go to the Laurel Canyon townhouse to teach them a lesson. Exactly how explicit those instructions were remained a matter of argument. Some said he wanted deaths, others claimed he only wanted a serious beating and the return of his property. Whatever his intent, 4 people had lost their lives, and 1 had survived only with life-altering injuries. For nearly a decade, those conclusions stayed largely hidden from public view, while investigators kept trying to strengthen their case. Some evidence was weak. Some witnesses unreliable. People tied to the underworld generally make poor witnesses. They lie to protect themselves. They disappear. They relapse into crime. A prosecutor weighing whether to charge a well-funded defendant like Eddie Nash had to ask whether a jury would believe such figures beyond a reasonable doubt. Eventually, the answer, at least in the eyes of Los Angeles County, became yes. Near the end of the 1,980 seconds, as he approached 60, the man who had arrived in America as a hopeful immigrant found himself indicted for multiple counts of homicide and related offenses stemming from the Wonderland case. A bodyguard, Greg Dials, was also charged. The state now openly claimed what had long been whispered, that he had been behind the retaliatory assault on the townhouse, acting out of anger and a desire to defend his reputation after being robbed. The announcement sent a shiver through those who had followed his story. For years, many people had assumed he would die, without ever facing a jury over the killings. Now, after complex grand jury proceedings and careful review of old files, he was being marched toward a full public trial. The press reported on his arraignment, printing photographs of an older, heavier man, sometimes using a cane, breathing with difficulty. As the case moved toward court, more details from his world spilled into view. Potential witnesses spoke of drug deliveries from his home, of cash counted in stacks on tables, of threats made in soft tones. One key witness was Scott Thorson, once the partner of the entertainer Liberace, who claimed that while high and emotional, Eddie had confessed involvement in the revenge attack. Defense lawyers hit back, attacking Thorson's credibility, pointing to his drug use and legal troubles. The case was shaping into a clash of damaged characters, each with reasons to twist reality. The trial that followed in 1990 brought the Wonderland story back into national conversation. Jurors listened to accounts of the 1,981 robbery, the rage that supposedly followed, and the deadly response in the Canyon townhouse. They saw images of the victims, heard from surviving family members, and listened while both sides argued over whether the aging club owner had enough direct connection to be held responsible. Prosecutors presented him as a powerful figure who had ruled with fear, who had used money and muscle to get his way, and who could not accept being humiliated. They described a man who ordered underlings to act, then stayed in the background while others carried out the physical violence. The defense painted a different image, an older, sickly businessman who, whatever his flaws with drugs and taxes, had not planned or ordered mass murder. They highlighted inconsistencies in witness testimony, questioned why certain evidence had taken so long to appear, and suggested that key accusers were motivated by plea deals and publicity. After weeks of testimony, the first jury could not reach a unanimous verdict. Reports said most jurors leaned toward acquittal, but one or more held out, unconvinced. The judge declared a mistrial. Prosecutors, still convinced of his guilt, chose to try again, rather than drop the case. A second trial followed, with new arguments, a slightly different cast of witnesses, and mounting legal bills on all sides. Again, the result was deadlock. Jurors split, unable to meet the standard required for conviction. With 2 mistrials and an aging defendant whose health kept deteriorating, the district attorney's office finally decided not to proceed with a third attempt. The murder charges were dismissed. On paper, he remained legally innocent of the deaths at Wonderland Avenue. Yet in the court of public opinion, the trials had cemented a certain narrative that he had probably been involved, but that the evidence, drawn from the murky world of drug dens and informants, had not been strong enough to pin him down. He walked out of that courthouse a free man, but not the triumphant figure he had once been. The legal battles had drained money, time, and energy. The government had seized assets along the way, and some of his remaining businesses were struggling. The man who had once ruled a chain of roaring clubs now lived in a much quieter way, spending long stretches at home, surrounded by reminders of a life that had raced out of control. Yet his story with the justice system was not over. Investigators hated leaving things unfinished. Federal prosecutors, watching from a distance, believed they could do what local authorities had not fully achieved, hold him accountable not only for drugs and bribery, but also for his role in the Wonderland saga, using broader conspiracy laws that did not require them to tie every act to his own hands. Quietly, methodically, they began building a new case, one that would reach back across decades of deals, threats, and hidden payments, and carry his name into courtrooms once again. Federal agents had long memories. For them, the hung juries in the Wonderland case were not an ending, only a pause. They watched the man who had walked out of the murder trials and asked a simple question. If he could beat charges like that twice, what had kept him protected for so long? They started by looking backward, not at the killings themselves, but at the patterns that had brought him there. Financial analysts combed through old bank records, tracing deposits, withdrawals, and cashier's checks tied to his clubs and properties. Drug investigators pulled dusty files from storage, reviewing every past arrest, every seized shipment, every confidential report that had mentioned his name. Corruption units reviewed internal affairs documents, trying to see whether past complaints about officers connected to him had been handled properly. One detail caught their attention more than most. A rumor that during his first state murder trial, someone had reached inside the jury box itself. Whispers had circulated for years that one juror had been strangely sympathetic to him, that no matter how the rest of the panel argued, this person refused to convict. Defense lawyers called it independence. Prosecutors, still stung by the loss, suspected something else. Federal prosecutors began quietly asking around, looking for anyone who might confirm that money had changed hands. In time, people did talk. Not loudly, not bravely, but enough. A former associate on the edge of trouble in another case mentioned that he had heard about a payoff. Someone else, questioned in a different investigation, described an ex-lawman who boasted about helping a juror during a big trial in Los Angeles. Each story alone was thin. Added together, they suggested that the myth of his untouchable courtroom victories might have been built partly on bribery. At the same time, federal agents were building a larger picture. They saw not just an aging club owner, but what law called an enterprise, a long-running network that had combined drug trafficking, hidden cash, money laundering, and efforts to influence public officials and court proceedings. Under federal racketeering law, they didn't have to show that he himself had swung a weapon in the Wonderland attack. They only needed to prove that the violence and the drug trade were part of a continuing organization he directed. Through the 1,990 seconds, while the public heard less about him, federal work on his case actually deepened. He was no longer opening famous venues or appearing in gossip columns. Instead, he spent much of his time in a fairly plain house in a quieter Los Angeles neighborhood, dealing with worsening health. Cigarettes, stress, and age had done their work. He had serious lung problems, carried extra weight, and sometimes sat for hours with an oxygen tube looped around his ears. Visitors who had known him in the roaring days of the Starwood barely recognized the slow-moving man in loose shirts and soft shoes. Yet the past refused to let him retire in peace. Old employees who had once feared him now felt safer speaking after the Wonderland trials. Some had found regular jobs or moved away from nightlife altogether. One by one, federal agents reached out to them. A few slammed doors or hung up phones. Others listened and chose to cooperate. They described how drugs had been kept in his home and clubs, how cash was split up after big weekends, how he had reacted when shorted on money. They also spoke about his temper, about threats made when someone crossed him, and about the way he liked to boast that no jury would ever convict him. Bits of information about the juror in the first murder trial gradually sharpened. Investigators pieced together a story in which an intermediary approached a panel member, offered money, and encouraged a vote against conviction. The funds, according to later court documents, came from him. Whether he had suggested the scheme or simply agreed to it remained a point of argument. But federal prosecutors believed they could prove that he had knowingly paid to corrupt the process that had once saved him. While those agents worked, his world kept shrinking. Most of his once famous clubs were gone, closed by changing fashions, police pressure, or financial strain. New owners took over old buildings and repainted the signs, erasing traces of his rule. Younger crowds danced in places that had never heard his name. For a man who had once stepped into his venues like a king, such invisibility must have stung. He lived off rental income, and whatever savings remained after years of lawyers, settlements, and seizures. The big luxury cars were fewer. The wardrobe, simpler. Friends from the wild days had either died, cleaned up, or drifted away. On many afternoons he sat watching television news, seeing reports of other criminal figures brought down by long investigations, knowing that somewhere in some office, people were still working on him. In 2000, the quiet ended. A federal grand jury handed down a sweeping indictment. It accused him of running a decades-long racketeering enterprise built on drugs, money laundering, and efforts to interfere with the justice system. One part of that case alleged that the Wonderland attack had not been just a random explosion of rage, but an act tied to the same criminal organization that had operated his clubs and drug sales. Another part focused squarely on the bribery of a juror in his first state murder trial. The indictment was a blow even for a man who had faced so many charges before. Federal court was different. Penalties could be far harsher, and the government had spent years preparing. They listed old cocaine deals, cash movements, and property transfers as part of a long pattern. Prosecutors alleged that he had not been a businessman who occasionally strayed over the line, but the head of an ongoing criminal network. He was in his 70s now, moving slowly, attached to oxygen during some appearances, yet he was marched once again in front of cameras and into a courtroom. Reporters, Some too young to remember the original Wonderland headlines scrambled to catch up on his story. Articles retold the arc of his life, from immigrant hot dog vendor to club empire builder to suspected mastermind of a revenge killing. Old photographs of neon signs and packed rock stages were printed alongside current images of a frail man in loose clothing, flanked by attorneys. Federal prosecutors did not need to prove that he had personally stepped into the Wonderland townhouse with a weapon. Instead, they described an order given in anger after the robbery, an instruction to deal with the people who had humiliated him. They argued that even if his words had been vague, he understood the type of men he was sending and what such an order would likely produce. They presented statements from witnesses who said he had later admitted some level of responsibility while under the influence, boasting or lamenting about what had happened. Just as important, they laid out their case about the juror. According to the federal government, during his first state murder trial, he had authorized a $50,000 payment to an intermediary who then approached a juror. The intermediary kept part of the money and passed the rest on, encouraging the juror to hold out. That holdout, if the government story was true, had produced the hung jury that had spared him from a possible life sentence or worse. To federal lawyers, this was not just a side detail. It was proof that he would go to great lengths to avoid conviction, even if it meant poisoning the heart of the justice system. His defense team pushed back. They pointed to his age, his failing health, and argued that the government was relitigating an old homicide case under a different label after twice failing to secure a conviction in state court. They said witnesses were unreliable, motivated by deals and grudges. They insisted that talk of bribery was exaggerated or invented. They also noted that he had already spent time in custody on earlier matters, and that his days of running any kind of enterprise were clearly behind him. Behind the legal arguments, however, his weakened condition created a practical question. A long federal trial would be hard on him physically. It would also be complicated for prosecutors, who had to rely on memories that were nearly 2 decades old, and witnesses whose lives had been damaged by drugs and crime. Both sides weighed their risks. For the government, a loss after so much effort would be a major embarrassment. For him, a conviction could mean spending the rest of his life in a federal cell or medical ward. In 2001, the long dance between him and the law took a decisive turn. Rather than gamble everything on a full trial, he agreed to a plea deal. In federal court, he admitted guilt on racketeering charges that included drug distribution, money laundering, and the bribery of a juror. As part of that agreement, he acknowledged that he had paid to influence a juror in his first state Wonderland trial, confirming what many had suspected for years. He also accepted responsibility for being the head of a criminal operation that had moved substantial quantities of cocaine and laundered the proceeds through various properties and businesses. The plea did not label him officially as a murderer, but it tied him, in legal language, to the violent culture and retaliation that surrounded the Wonderland case. Prosecutors, for their part, agreed to drop some of the most severe counts and to recommend a sentence that took into account his age and health. The judge, considering the agreement, sentenced him to a term that reflected his guilty pleas, but was far shorter than the maximums originally hanging over his head. He received a few years in federal custody, part of which overlapped with time he had already served while awaiting trial, followed by supervised release. To some observers, the outcome felt unsatisfying. Families of the Wonderland victims saw an elderly man serve only a small fraction of his remaining life behind bars for conduct that, in their view, had destroyed far more lives. Detectives who had chased his case for decades shrugged bitterly, saying they had at least finally secured an admission that he had sabotaged the earlier jury. Others in law enforcement argued that it was better to win a solid plea on serious charges than to risk another dramatic, inconclusive trial. In federal custody, he was no longer the host of anything. Gone were the velvet ropes and loud guitars. Days were measured in head counts, meal trays, and medical checkups. He moved slowly through institutional hallways, an old man surrounded by strangers, some of whom had never heard of his clubs or his role in Hollywood's nightlife. For the first time since he had arrived in the United States, his choices were strictly limited. Lights went off and on at someone else's command. Doors opened only when others decided. He did his time quietly. There were no major disciplinary issues reported, no dramatic incidents. This was not the brash younger man who had once argued with inspectors and barked orders at staff. It was a tired figure dealing with the routines of a prison system and the steady advance of illness. When his sentence ended and he was released under supervision, he emerged not as a comeback story, but as someone nearing the final chapters of a complicated life. Back in Los Angeles, he moved into a modest home, far from the main nightlife districts that had once been his territory. He kept a low profile, avoiding interviews and public appearances. The oxygen tank that had appeared in earlier years was now a more constant companion. People who met him in that period often described a soft-spoken elder who watched a lot of television, rarely went out at night, and had a small number of regular visitors. But even in that quieter setting, the ghosts of his past were never far away. Documentary makers, crime writers, and amateur investigators continued to dig into the Wonderland case and his career. They pored over transcripts and police reports, replayed old interviews, and tried to understand how a boy from a troubled corner of the Middle East had become a central figure in one of Los Angeles's darkest crime stories. Sometimes they knocked on his door hoping he would talk. Most of the time, he did not answer. When he did, he usually kept his comments brief, avoiding any full confession or expression of deep remorse. The city around him changed. Areas that had once been rough now sported expensive coffee shops and boutiques. Some of his former club locations were turned into new venues, with no trace of their earlier lives except in the memories of aging musicians and longtime residents. Younger Angelenos streamed into brightly lit bars and crowded music festivals, unaware that the paths they walked had been shaped by an earlier generation of operators who neglected the law and played dangerous games with power, loyalty, and fear. Inside that small house, surrounded by mementos from his rise and fall, he had long hours to think. He could look back on the hot dog stand, the packed dance floors, the thick rolls of cash, the tense meetings with lawyers, the raids, the trials, the deals, and the plea that finally forced him to admit at least part of what he had done. Whatever he told himself in those moments, the record outside his walls was clear. The same relentless drive that had lifted him out of poverty had also led him to choices that harmed many, tarnished his name, and turned his life into a cautionary tale about ambition without restraint. In the quiet years after his release, his life no longer followed the pulse of amplifiers and bar registers. Dawn didn't find him driving home from a club. It found him already awake in an armchair, television glowing in front of him, oxygen machine humming softly in the corner. The man who had once strutted through packed rooms now shuffled slowly from bedroom to kitchen, pausing to catch his breath with one hand on the wall. Neighbors on his block mostly knew him only as an elderly immigrant who rarely left the house. They saw grocery bags delivered, nurses or aides stopping by, an occasional visitor helping him down the steps to sit in the sun for a few minutes. Some had no idea that the frail man exchanging pleasantries about trash pickup and parking spaces had once been linked in headlines to drugs, crooked officers, and one of Los Angeles's most famous murder cases. Supervised release meant he still had obligations. He met with federal officers from time to time, answered questions about where he lived, how he supported himself, who he saw. There were rules about staying away from guns, illegal drugs, and certain people from his past. For a man who had spent decades building networks and bending rules, the oversight must have felt intrusive, but age and exhaustion had drained the fight from him. He signed the forms, answered the minimum, and went home. Money no longer flowed in as it had when his clubs thrived, but he was not destitute. Years earlier, he had sunk profits into apartment houses and commercial parcels. Many of those properties remained, even after government seizures and fines. Rent checks and modest investments covered his basic expenses. Instead of carrying rolls of cash in his pockets, he now relied on checks in the mail, bank cards, and routine withdrawals, quietly handled by relatives or trusted helpers. Family ties for a man like him were complex. Over the years, his pursuit of business and his immersion in nightlife had strained marriages and relationships. Nights spent in clubs or at card tables, surrounded by drugs and volatile characters, did not blend well with home life. Yet he was not completely alone. Children and other relatives visited, bringing food, handling paperwork, or simply sitting with him while he watched old movies. Some had grown up hearing whispers about his career. Others had lived through raids and court dates. For them, he was at once a father or uncle, and a constant reminder of how far unchecked ambition could carry a person into danger. As he rested in his small living room, the city outside kept changing. Areas where his businesses once stood were transformed. Old buildings were remodeled into boutiques, theaters, or sleek lounges aimed at a different kind of customer. On Santa Monica Boulevard and around Hollywood, construction crews tore down or repainted sites that had once housed his clubs. The Starwood, once a legendary venue for emerging rock bands, had closed long ago. By the 2000s, nothing of the old spot was left but stories told by aging musicians about chaos, opportunity, and the imposing owner who had paced the balcony. Those stories, and the darker ones surrounding Wonderland, refused to die. Even as he withered in obscurity, filmmakers and writers were turning his past into material. In 1998, a documentary about John Holmes traced the adult performer's rise and fall, mentioning the powerful figure who had supplied him with drugs and whose house had been robbed. In 2003, the feature film Wonderland dramatized the 1981 case. Actor Eric Bogosian played an intense, menacing nightclub operator named Eddie Nash, with heavy jewelry and a cool stare, a character clearly based on him. People who went to the movie saw a compressed, stylized version of events. Holmes stumbling between drug binges, the robbery at the hillside home, the violent retaliation at the Canyon townhouse. The film took liberties with details, but it stamped his name into another generation's memory as the shadowy figure at the center of it all. He did not publicly sue or mount big protests. Age and health made that unlikely. Once or twice, in brief comments to reporters, he grumbled that Hollywood had exaggerated and misunderstood, but mostly he stayed silent, letting the fictionalized version float above the real one already fixed in court documents and police files. Journalists kept circling back as well. True crime books devoted chapters to his clubs, his rumored connections to corrupt officers, his federal plea, and his disputed role in Wonderland. Magazine articles described him as a symbol of a particular Los Angeles moment, the crossing point between rock music, the adult film industry, cocaine culture, and the city's underworld. They painted pictures of packed rooms full of sweat and cigarette smoke, where bikers shared space with aspiring actors and producers, all under the watch of a man who had discovered that pleasures people would brag about during the day were often purchased in ways they'd rather hide. Those accounts also revisited crimes that had never attracted as much attention as Wonderland, but were central to his career. Long before the famous case, he had already been arrested for serious narcotics violations. In the early 1982s, he had faced state charges for possession of cocaine for sale and related offenses. Police had seized significant quantities of drugs and cash from his properties. Court records from that period show convictions for narcotics, crimes, and weapons counts, followed by terms in state custody and probation. He sometimes secured lighter sentences than prosecutors wanted, thanks to skilled defense counsel, crowded prisons, or health claims. Still, those convictions were real. They documented that he had moved far beyond merely turning a blind eye to customers' habits. He had become a central supplier in a lucrative illegal market, using his night spots as supply lines and his home as a distribution point. The federal plea years later folded many of those activities into one long pattern, acknowledging that his involvement in drug trade and money laundering stretched over decades. Another recurring theme in those retrospectives was the claim of corruption. In interviews and testimony, several retired officers and former associates said that he had paid at least one law enforcement official for information about planned raids and investigations. Federal prosecutors in the RICO case echoed those allegations, arguing that he had used those leaks to move drugs or weapons before search teams arrived, or to hide other evidence of wrongdoing. While not every rumor could be proved, the Jura Raberberry admission in his plea added weight to the notion that he was willing to buy influence when necessary, whether inside a police station or inside a deliberation room. Looking back, commentators noted that he had touched nearly every rung of the criminal ladder short of pulling a trigger in public. He had started with regulatory violations, serving drinks too late, skirting licensing rules, then graduated to large-scale drug supply, tax evasion, and repeated efforts to warp the legal system. At each stage, money and connections cushioned the risks, until a combination of federal determination, aging allies, and his own guilty plea finally pinned him to a set of admitted facts. The Wonderland victims' families had their own view of that arc. For them, the critical line was not about grams of cocaine or envelopes of cash, but about the moment when a group of people broke into a Laurel Canyon townhouse and left loved ones dead or permanently damaged. Over the years, as documentaries and films dramatized the case, some family members gave interviews describing grief that never really faded and anger at a system that had never formally labeled him a murderer. They listened when he eventually acknowledged in federal court that he had paid to sway a juror in the first Wonderland trial. That admission confirmed that a verdict which might have answered their questions had been corrupted. Knowing that, they watched him serve a limited federal term and then return home to live out his final decade. For some, that outcome felt bitter. They could not change it, but they refused to forget it. In contrast, a few people from his earlier business circles held more complicated feelings. Some remembered him as the immigrant who had given them a first job when no one else would, who had loaned them money or forgiven a debt when they were broke, who had shown surprising acts of generosity in private. To them, the world he moved in had always mixed kindness and exploitation, loyalty and fear. They didn't deny his serious wrongdoing, but they also remembered his jokes, his stubborn pride in having built something from nothing, his ability to spot talent in a young band before anyone else cared. He himself rarely addressed these contradictions in public. When reporters managed to ask him about the past, he tended to deflect, saying that he had been just a businessman or that he had made mistakes like anyone. On one occasion, he told an interviewer that stories about him ordering killings were lies, insisting that he had never wanted anyone dead over a robbery. At other points, he acknowledged that his drug involvement had been serious and destructive, admitting that he had hurt himself and others by staying in that trade for so long. What he thought in private, sitting alone after visitors left, remains known only to him. Did he replay the morning of the robbery at his house, the humiliation of being attacked in his robe, the fear in his chest as intruders shouted and demanded money? Did he think of the people who died 2 days later, of their families, of the detectives who had spent careers trying to solve what they believed he had set in motion? Or did he focus mainly on the slights he felt, the fortunes lost to seizures and legal fees, the sense that others had betrayed him when the pressure rose? Human memory is rarely neat, especially after a lifetime built on both pride and denial. Physically, his body kept narrowing his options. Lung disease worsened. Walks that had once taken minutes now required long pauses. Hospital visits became more frequent. Doctors adjusted medications, recommended oxygen use even during sleep, warned about the risks of further strain. He was no longer a candidate for long trips, so whatever remained of his world had to reach him: children, old friends, occasional reporters, and the television, which in many ways served as his last window on the city he had helped shape and scar. Occasionally, a documentary about the 1,970 seconds rock scene, or about Hollywood's hidden underbelly would air. Viewers who knew his story imagined him seeing grainy footage of his old venues or hearing his own name spoken by a narrator. Perhaps he changed the channel. Perhaps he watched quietly, seeing his younger self portrayed by actors or described by others. If he felt misrepresented, he did little to correct the record. The official narrative of his life now lived mostly in court transcripts, police summaries, and the way those documents had been interpreted by writers and filmmakers. By the early 2010 seconds, he was an old man in his 80s, moving through a short daily routine. Wake, sit, eat, rest, answer a few phone calls, watch more television, sleep. The suspense of law enforcement raids and headline trials was gone. Federal supervision ended. He was, in a formal sense, free. But his world had shrunk to a few rooms and a small circle of people willing to stay in touch with a figure whose name still made some shudder. In August 2014, his long, complicated journey ended. He died in Los Angeles at about 85 years old, after years of chronic illness. News of his passing reached the public in brief items: a short obituary here, a wire service note there, each one reminding readers that this was the nightclub magnate tied to the Wonderland murders, the man who had once admitted bribing a juror and running a cocaine operation from his clubs and home. No grand public funeral followed, no parade of celebrities. His departure was mostly quiet, noticed most by those who had studied his story or lived through its events. Reactions mirrored the fractures of his life. Some former colleagues expressed muted sadness, remembering a charismatic boss who had given them their start. Family members mourned privately. Law enforcement veterans, now retired themselves, talked among one another about the long, tangled fight to bring him into a federal courtroom, wondering if justice had really caught up or had only brushed against him. The families of Wonderland victims were reminded again that the man long suspected of setting that tragedy in motion had died without any murder conviction on his record. In the years since, His name has continued to surface in books, podcasts, and documentaries exploring Los Angeles in the 1,970 seconds and 1,980 seconds. His life is often presented as a case study in how legitimate business and criminal enterprise can intertwine, especially in places where entertainment, wealth, and secrecy collide. Writers point to his trajectory: poor immigrant, industrious worker, savvy restaurateur, aggressive club owner, then full-fledged drug trafficker and corrupter of courts, as an example of how ambition, when unrestrained by ethics, can warp every opportunity it touches. They note that he might have remained remembered simply as a tough but successful promoter who helped launch bands and ran busy rooms. Instead, his name is now fused with words like racketeering, juror bribery, and multiple homicide investigation. The same organizational talent that built a nightlife empire ended up organizing the flow of illegal drugs and money, and according to many who investigated him, shaping a culture in which violent retaliation felt like a plausible response to perceived humiliation. For people trying to understand how cities evolve, his story also offers a different kind of lesson. Today's visitors who stroll past trendy storefronts and polished sidewalks in Hollywood might see only surface glamour. Those who remember back a few decades know that under those bright signs once lived a fragile, often lawless world in which music, money, and narcotics collided under the direction of men like him. That history helped shape the regulations, policing strategies, and community pressures that now govern nightlife in the city. Some former club kids from his era, now gray-haired, look back with a mix of nostalgia and discomfort. They remember first concerts, romantic encounters, and the thrill of walking past long lines thanks to a bouncer's nod. Then they remember the dealers in the bathrooms, the overdoses, the fights, and the news reports about Wonderland. Their youth, in many ways, was lived inside the system. He created a system that cost other people their lives and left deep scars. From a distance, removed from the personalities and specific locations, his life can be seen as a long chain of choices. He could have stopped at the restaurant, at the early clubs, even after the first serious drug charges. Each fork in the road offered a chance to pull back toward cleaner profit. Each time he chose deeper involvement, larger risks, and more ruthless tactics. The law caught up slowly, unevenly, but it did catch up. By then, the damage both to others and to his own future was impossible to undo. In that sense, the old man who died quietly in Los Angeles in 2014 is both a unique figure and a familiar type. Unique because of the particular mix of Hollywood glamour and high-profile crime that clung to his name. Familiar because history across many cities has seen versions of the same story. A driven outsider who learns the rules, bends them, gets rich, crosses lines, and eventually finds that the same system he manipulated can still close around him. Eddie Nash's path from a tense homeland to neon-lit clubs and then to federal courtrooms remains one of the starkest examples of how far that pattern can go when no inner break ever truly engages. Years after his death, a man with thinning gray hair stood on a corner of Santa Monica Boulevard, trying to line up his memory with what he saw in front of him. In the late 1,970 seconds, he had played guitar in a band that barely made it out of garages. Back then, getting a slot at one of the hot Hollywood clubs had felt like winning the lottery. The Starwood had been one of those places. Now, the building was gone, replaced by something anonymous. Traffic rolled by. No crowds, no bouncers, no flyers stapled to poles. He closed his eyes and could still picture it. Kids with feathered hair and leather jackets standing in line, the thud of drums leaking through the walls. Some nights a whiff of tear gas from a fight out front that got out of hand. He remembered the owner too. Not a faceless corporate manager, but a short, intense man with dark eyes and a heavy accent who walked through the club like he owned every breath taken in it. Which he did. Eddie Nash. For musicians, dealing with him was a mix of hope and unease. If he liked your sound and thought you could bring in a crowd, he could put you on a bill that might change your life. Bands that later filled arenas had sweated on his stages early on. At the same time, everyone knew that the real business in his rooms went far beyond ticket sales. The money that mattered came from the bar, the back corners, and what people bought or arranged under the cover of darkness and loud amplifiers. He ran his places with a sharp eye for detail. Door staff were drilled on who to let in free, who to charge extra, who to turn away without explanation. Certain regulars, dealers, favored customers, off-duty officers got nods and handshakes instead of full searches. Security watched the floor, but was careful not to see too much in some areas. Bartenders knew when to water drinks, when to pour heavy for a valuable patron, when to cut someone off and have them steered politely toward the exit. Invoices and ledgers rarely told the whole story. On paper, the clubs looked like many other nightlife businesses, a combination of cover charges, drink sales, and occasional food. In reality, a second economy pulsed through them. Cash from drugs moved from hand to hand, then into back offices, then into safes, and later into other properties. Some of that money was reported to tax authorities as legitimate income. Some of it never appeared anywhere official, instead reappearing as a down payment on a building, a car title, or a loan to a partner with no clear paperwork trail. Agents who later tried to untangle his finances described a maze of shell companies and shifting ownerships. One holding company might technically own a building, but practical control still sat with him. Another entity would show profits that had actually come from a different address. Accounts were opened and closed. Cash was broken into smaller deposits to avoid automatic scrutiny. For years, this worked well enough. Tax agencies had limited manpower, and unless someone complained loudly or a tip landed in the right inbox, audits were rare. That didn't mean he avoided every brush with financial law. At various points, he faced questions about unpaid taxes and unreported earnings. Settlements were reached, penalties paid. Compared to the larger criminal risks he ran with drugs and potential violence, tax trouble probably felt like just another cost of doing business. But the pattern hiding income, moving money through different channels, fit the larger picture of a man for whom transparency was never the default. His relationship with police was another tangle of open doors and closed files. In the early days, some officers saw him as a useful figure. He kept order inside big rooms where chaos was always near the surface. When fights broke out, his security teams usually had them under control before cruisers arrived. He could be generous with free meals and quiet donations. For beat cops working long hours in rough neighborhoods, a hot plate and a friendly greeting went a long way. Over time, however, that friendliness shaded into something more troubling. Testimony in later proceedings and investigative reporting suggested that at least one law enforcement officer accepted money from him in exchange for information about planned raids or ongoing inquiries. In some accounts, he was tipped off about upcoming checks, giving him time to move drugs or raise the alarm among associates. These allegations, backed by plea agreements and federal filings, added weight to the idea that his apparent luck in avoiding big busts for so long had been helped along from the inside. Yet he was never simply a cartoon villain in a suit. People who dealt with him day to day often saw a complicated mix of traits. He could be generous, paying medical bills for an employee's family member, or quietly covering a band's shortfall when ticket sales disappointed but the show had driven bar revenue. He also could be harsh, turning on someone instantly if he felt they had stolen from him or shown disloyalty. Those who disappointed him described icy lectures delivered in a low voice, sometimes followed by a threat that left no doubt about who held power. As an immigrant from a turbulent part of the world, he carried old scars and a sense of being an outsider. In interviews, he occasionally hinted at early discrimination and frustration finding work when he arrived in the United States. He felt that many native-born owners and officials treated him with suspicion or condescension. To prove them wrong or to prove himself right, he drove harder than most, working long hours, reinvesting profits, and expanding whenever he saw an opening. That determination, which might have remained admirable in a different context, helped fuel his slide into more dangerous territory. He liked to describe himself, when speaking to reporters, as just a businessman. It was a phrase he used more than once. In his mind, he seemed to place what he did in a gray zone, supplying what people already wanted. Running rooms where musicians and audiences could meet, taking advantage of loopholes like others did, just on a bigger scale. When asked directly about accusations that he had used violence or ordered harm, he typically denied it flatly, insisting that he did not need such tactics, that his success came from hustle and intelligence, not brutality. Investigators and prosecutors painted a different picture. In their version, he was not just reacting to demand. He was nurturing and exploiting it, pushing substances into social circles where they would take deep root, then defending his position through intimidation and, at times, very real danger. They pointed out that drugs moving through his venues contributed to addictions, overdoses, and the funding of other crimes. They argued that his decisions, taken together over decades, had a human cost far beyond his own circle. His entanglement with the adult film world, mainly through his connection to John Holmes, illustrated how easily different subcultures overlapped in his orbit. Porn producers and actors came to his clubs to unwind, to network, to get high. Bikers used the same rooms as meeting places and markets. Aspiring actors and musicians drifted there hoping to be discovered, becoming part of a crowd that made illegal dealing easier to disguise. He stood at the center, a host who also saw every person as a potential link to more profit. Before the Wonderland ordeal, there were other episodes where violence touched his story, though often indirectly. Robberies targeted his associates. Disputes over debts led to beatings carried out by others who moved in his circles. Guns and other weapons seized in police raids of his properties suggested that staff around him prepared for trouble. Whatever he personally ordered or sanctioned, he chose to operate in an environment where threats and retaliation were considered normal tools. When federal prosecutors finally got him to admit to juror bribery, it undercut his favorite self-description. A simple businessman might bend a zoning rule or misreport some cash. Paying to taint a murder trial went far beyond that. It showed that when enough was at stake, his freedom, his status, his survival, he was willing to sabotage the core process meant to hold powerful people accountable. For agents who had chased him for years, that plea confirmed their belief that corruption had not been a side habit of his life, but one of its central strategies. After his death, as more documents became available, and investigators felt freer to speak, a fuller accounting of his criminal record and influence emerged. It included repeated convictions for possessing and selling illegal narcotics, especially cocaine, often in large quantities, with evidence that his homes and clubs functioned as distribution points. Firearms violations tied to weapons found during searches, raising questions about how his staff might have used those arms to protect drug stashes or intimidate rivals. Tax and revenue irregularities, including underreported income and schemes to move money through different companies in ways that obscured its illegal origins. The admitted bribery of a juror in a murder trial, a direct attack on the integrity of a system already struggling to handle complex, high-profile cases. Allegations, backed in part by cooperator statements and plea agreements, that he had paid at least one law enforcement insider for investigative secrets, thereby sabotaging honest policing and endangering officers who went into situations without full information. On top of those documented wrongs stood the unresolved question of whether he had ordered, or at least set in motion, the events that ended with multiple people dead on Wonderland Avenue. Legally, he died without a murder conviction. Practically, many detectives, prosecutors, writers, and observers remained convinced that his anger and instructions after the robbery had shaped the retaliation that followed, even if they could not prove it to the strict standard required in court. Why does this long list of misconduct still hold attention today? Partly because it illustrates how someone can move step by step from cutting corners to deep criminality without ever making a single dramatic leap. His first ventures into ruler-breaking seemed, to those around him, almost minor. Serving drinks too late, letting underage fans slip into clubs with borrowed IDs, ignoring occupancy limits. Such flexibility made his rooms popular and profitable. It also taught him that rules were negotiable. As profits grew, each boundary he crossed became easier to justify in his mind. If letting a few underage kids into a show was acceptable because it kept the music scene alive, perhaps letting smaller-time dealers operate in a corner was acceptable because it kept the bar busy. From there, stocking his own product in larger quantities, arranging supplies, and taking a share of sales didn't feel like a different world, just an extension. Once the drug revenue started outstripping the legitimate bar take, there was little incentive to step back. By the time he was paying bribes to lawmen and jurors, the distance between hot dog stand operator and seasoned criminal was vast, but the path between them had been made up of many incremental choices. That's part of what makes his story feel instructive, rather than simply sensational. It shows how, in an environment where profit is prized, oversight is uneven, and temptations are constant, a driven person can slide into a role he might never have pictured for himself at the start. For Los Angeles, his career formed just one thread in a wider tapestry of vice, ambition, and reinvention. The city marketed itself as a dream factory, Yet it also harbored back rooms where those dreams were bought, sold, and sometimes destroyed. He understood both sides of that equation. He knew how to sell fantasy a night out, a big break, a taste of something forbidden. He also knew how to collect when fantasy turned into dependency, whether on drugs, status, or access. That double awareness helped him accumulate power quickly, but it also ensured that when his fall came, it would be tangled up with countless other people's stories. Musicians who got chances in his rooms, performers who found drugs in his hallways, officers who accepted or rejected his favors, jurors whose duties were threatened by his money, and families who lost loved ones in a case that many believe he set in motion. However, people judge him as a villain, as a product of his time, as a complicated mix of both. His life makes clear how one man's hustle can leave a long, dark shadow over a city's history. In the years after his passing, his story lingered in Los Angeles like a faint smell of cigarette smoke in an old curtain. You couldn't see it outright if you walked down Sunset or Santa Monica boulevards, but if you knew where to look, an old photograph on a bar wall, a footnote in a documentary, you could trace the outline of the life he'd led. In a small house miles away from the old club strips, a retired detective sometimes sat at his kitchen table with a mug of coffee going cool in his hand, thinking about the man he had spent so much of his career chasing. He joined the department young, when rock clubs were booming, and cocaine was starting to surface in every case file. By the time he was assigned to narcotics, and then to task forces that overlapped with homicide, the name Eddie Nash was already written in big letters on a corkboard. The detective remembered the first time he'd been sent to one of those venues. The assignment had been simple: observe, make notes, don't be obvious. He'd stood in a dark corner, watching kids in band T-through shirts slam into each other near the stage while bartenders moved non-stop. Between songs, certain people drifted through the crowd, slipping into bathrooms and back hallways, then returning with hands in pockets and twitchy eyes. He'd reported what he saw, but follow-up raids never seemed to hit the right night. Later, when corruption investigations cracked open parts of the department, it began to make sense to him why some enforcement had always felt one step behind. He came to believe that someone was warning the club owner before big moves. The thought that his own organization might have been leaking to a man they were supposed to be watching left a sour taste that never fully faded. For detectives like him, the Wonderland case became the central knot they couldn't completely untie. The photographs from that townhouse, the interviews with neighbors who'd heard screams or strange noises, the sight of John Holmes in an interrogation room, shifting and dodging questions, all of it stayed vivid. And always, in the background, there was Eddie. Officially a victim of a robbery. Unofficially the man everyone pointed to when talk turned to revenge. Each time they thought they had enough to nail him for murder, something fell apart. A witness recanted, or two statements didn't match, or a juror held out. When news filtered through years later that he had admitted paying to sway that first jury, the retired detective had felt equal parts satisfaction and anger. Satisfaction that his hunch had been right. Anger because the admission came long after the moment, when it could have delivered full justice for the victims. He sometimes told younger officers about the case, not to dwell on frustration, but as a lesson in patience and thoroughness. You might think you're just working a dope case, he would say, but you have no idea where those lines lead. We thought he was just a club guy with cocaine. Then there were bodies in a canyon, and years of lawyers fighting over what happened. You follow money, you follow dope, you might end up staring right at a multiple homicide. Elsewhere, a woman in her late 50s sorted through an old box of keepsakes from her 20s. At the bottom, she found a laminated badge, the kind worn by staff at a nightclub. It had the name of one of his places printed under the club logo. She had been a cocktail server there in the late 1972, working double shifts, legs aching by the end of each night, pockets heavy with tips. When she first took the job, she'd seen it as an adventure. The room throbbed with music. There was always someone interesting at a table. She'd watched bands on the cusp of fame and recognized them later when their songs came on the radio. To her, the owner was a distant figure, someone she saw sweeping through with security in tow, checking the bar, scanning the crowd. He rarely spoke directly to the floor staff, unless there was a complaint or a compliment to pass on. At first, she hadn't paid much attention to the side deals happening near the bathrooms or in quiet corners of the balcony. She knew people were using cocaine. In that era, it seemed like everyone did. Only later, When police raided the place and she saw the search warrants and evidence bags, did she grasp that she had been working not just in a glamorous club, but in a space that doubled as a distribution hub. Some of the bartenders and doormen she joked with were also moving product. The man who signed her paychecks wasn't just a tough boss. He was, in the eyes of the law, running an illegal trade under the cover of loud guitar riffs. She left nightlife shortly after a close friend overdosed. It took her a long time to stop picturing that club when she closed her eyes at night. Even decades later, reading about his federal plea stirred complicated feelings. On the one hand, she believed he deserved punishment. On the other, she couldn't erase the memory of him quietly paying for a bouncer's hospital bill without telling anyone, or the time he waived a fee so a struggling band could shoot a live video in the room. She found herself caught between remembering individual acts of kindness and recognizing that the entire environment he created had pulled people toward habits that wrecked lives. In another part of town, a writer hunched over a desk surrounded by stacks of documents, trial transcripts, grand jury minutes, old newspaper clippings. He was working on a book about Los Angeles in the 1970 seconds and 1980 seconds. Not the glitzy version of starlets and premieres, but the underground version of drug pipelines, payoffs, and notorious cases. Eddie Nash's name kept appearing at the intersection of all those storylines. The writer marveled at how one person's life could touch so many corners of a city's history. Here was an immigrant kid from a tense region, roasting hot dogs near Hollywood Boulevard, learning by watching who spent money and how. Then, within a couple of decades, here was the same man sitting in a hillside home, safe full of cash, illegal drugs stashed behind false panels, bodyguards at the door. He owned or controlled popular venues, where pseudo-defensive bands just starting their careers played shoulder to shoulder with unknowns who would never leave the smaller club circuit. The more the writer read, the more he saw patterns. Early on, zoning boards and alcohol license officers had tried to rein in his operations. Fines for overcrowding, warnings about fights, notes about underage patrons. Each time he negotiated, paid, or found another way to keep his rooms open. When narcotics detectives began hearing his name in connection with cocaine supply, he seemed to shift from open front-of-house presence to more behind-of-the-scenes control, using employees and partners to handle risky parts of the business. Then came the big pivot, the 1980, one robbery, the Wonderland attack, the long courts battles. That episode alone had spawned enough articles and documentaries to fill a small library. Yet to the writer, it was just one illustration, albeit a deadly one, of what happens when a business rests on intimidation, illegal profits, and the belief that reputation must be defended at any cost. Even if he accepted his later line that he had never ordered anyone killed, the writer could not ignore how years of cultivating fear and dependence had created a context in which extreme retaliation seemed almost inevitable. The book he was drafting framed Eddie's story not as the tale of a uniquely evil mastermind, but as the story of a man whose skills were sharpened by hardship and then turned toward ruthless ends. He had a gift for reading people, for seeing where energy and money would flow. In another life, that gift might have made him a respected entertainment impresario. In the life he actually lived, it made him fluent in exploiting addiction and buying silence. Law schools used parts of his court record in classes about trial tactics and plea negotiations. In one seminar, a professor recounted the Wonderland prosecutions as an example of how cases built largely on informants and addicted witnesses can fall apart under cross-examination. Students read how key witnesses against him had long criminal records and heavy personal baggage. They examined why juries hesitated to convict when the state's main storytellers were people they instinctively distrusted. Then, in a different session, the same professor walked them through the later federal plea. Here, the evidence didn't just rest on unsteady witnesses. It tied in bank records, seized narcotics, recorded conversations, and the fact that he himself, under oath, had finally admitted bribing a juror. It became a lesson in the difference between pursuing a single dramatic homicide conviction and methodically building a broader racketeering case that took in an entire web of conduct. For community activists and families affected by addiction, his legacy took on yet another shape. When they spoke at neighborhood meetings, warning parents about the long reach of drug markets, they sometimes mentioned his clubs as historical examples. Those places had offered more than music and drinks. They had normalized heavy cocaine use among people who thought of themselves as creative, free-spirited, above ordinary rules. Speakers would describe how normal it had once seemed to snort a line in a bathroom at a rock show, how little thought anyone gave to the supply chain that brought the powder there, or to the families of those who would spiral into dependency. They would remind their audiences that behind scenes of glamour and fun, someone always made money, and that sometimes those someones cared very little about the fallout. His name became shorthand in those talks for the shadowy entrepreneur who stands at the end of that chain, counting profits while telling himself he is just meeting demand. New club owners opening venues in gentrifying neighborhoods also heard his name spoken as a warning. City inspectors and licensing boards, burned by the excesses of past eras, drafted stricter rules in part because of what had happened in his time. Capacity limits were enforced more firmly. Security procedures were written down instead of improvised. Owners were pressed to keep clearer distance from anyone dealing drugs on their property. The unwritten message: if you let your place become the kind of operation his had been, expect a very different kind of scrutiny now. For some immigrants, his story carried a different sort of caution. Community elders would point to his rise as proof that someone from their background could, with enough drive and shrewdness, climb to wealth in America. Then they would point to his fall, and to the trail of harm behind him, as proof that chasing status without regard for law or conscience could wreck not just one person, but generations around him. They would remind younger listeners that success built on illegal foundations can look impressive for a while, but it rarely ends well. Even within the law enforcement world, reflection on his case led to changes. Investigations into the leaks and favors that had helped him avoid early raids helped fuel reforms in internal affairs units. Training for officers eventually included more direct warnings about how accepting even small gifts from powerful business owners could spiral into compromised judgment and quiet arrangements. His juror bribery admission sparked serious conversations about juror protection, vetting processes, and the need to watch more carefully for attempts to influence panel members in high-profile trials. In the end, what remained of him in the public imagination was not a single clear image but a collage. To some, he was the aging man, shuffling through a federal courthouse with oxygen tubes on his face. To others, he was the heavy-ringed figure sitting in a dark club office, deciding which band got a shot and which dealer could work the floor. To still others, he was the angry, humiliated homeowner demanding payback after a group of desperate thieves stormed his house. All of those pictures held some truth, but none told the whole story on its own. The full story lived in the long arc from a childhood in a conflict-scarred land, through hustling on Hollywood sidewalks, into the smoky centers of rock and roll nightlife, downward into concentrated cocaine trafficking and court corruption, and finally into a frail old age marked by oxygen tanks and regret that he rarely voiced aloud. Whether people saw that arc as tragic, infuriating, or simply instructive, often depended on where their own lives intersected with his. A retired detective might see him as a symbol of how hard it can be to bring a resourceful criminal to justice. A former club kid might remember the best concert of their life, and only later recognize the damage running beneath the surface. A victim's family member might see only a man who escaped the full measure of accountability. A law student might see a complex case study, but underneath all those interpretations lay a plain reality. He had choices at every stage. He chose to use his intelligence and drive not just to build businesses, but to anchor them in drug, money. He chose to answer threat with intimidation and, according to many accounts, with violence carried out by others. He chose to tamper with a jury when he felt the system closing in. Each choice brought shorter-term advantage and long-term cost, not only for him but for many others whose lives brushed up against his. In that way, long after his body was laid to rest, Eddie Nash continued to matter not because people admired him, but because his life stood as a map of how greed, fear, and a talent for reading people can combine to bend an entire corner of a city in a darker direction. On certain nights, when the air over Los Angeles hangs still, and the hills are lined with tiny lights, the city itself can feel like it's holding its breath. If you drove those streets with an older local riding beside you, pointing out places as you went, you'd hear names long erased from signs. There used to be a club over there, they might say, gesturing toward an anonymous strip mall. This corner used to jump till sunrise. More often than people realize, those memories trace back to spaces he once controlled. Most of the people now crowding Hollywood sidewalks have never heard his name. They pose for photos near theaters, buy coffee in sleek cafes, and stream into carefully regulated venues where IDs are checked by scanners and security cameras cover every angle. To them, the idea that this same ground once hosted a rougher world, one threaded through with illegal drugs, side deals, and silent understandings between owners and certain officers, feels like something from fiction. Yet in old city archives, his presence is written plainly. There are business licenses connected to his restaurants and clubs. There are arrest reports listing charges for possession of cocaine for sale, firearms violations, and related counts. There are court minutes detailing guilty pleas to drug and tax offenses. There is the federal transcript in which he admits that he paid to influence a juror in a murder trial that revolved around his own robbed home and a retaliatory attack that left 4 dead and 1 gravely injured. Those documents sketch a life where wrongdoing was not an occasional slip but a running theme. They show a man who used his clubs not only as music venues and bars, but also as places where cocaine was stored and sold in quantity, making him a major supplier rather than a bystander to customer habits. Kept large sums of undeclared cash, moved money through different companies and accounts to disguise its source, and underreported income to tax authorities. Maintained weapons and properties tied to his operations, creating an atmosphere where force was always close at hand, even if he rarely brandished it himself. Cultivated relationships with at least one insider in law enforcement, according to sworn statements, paying for advance notice of investigations and raids. As he eventually admitted, authorized a payment to an intermediary who then handed money to a juror in his first Wonderland-related murder trial, deliberately corrupting a process meant to decide whether he would be held responsible for multiple deaths. What those records cannot fully capture is the sensation of being near him when he was at his height. The way his staff snapped to attention when he entered a room, the way other hustlers lowered their voices when speaking his name. Former doormen have said that just the rumor of his displeasure could make someone vanish quietly from a job or a scene. Dealers understood that working his floors without his blessing was dangerous. Musicians knew that offending him could shut doors in parts of the city where he still had pull. The irony is that he had once stood on the other side of that divide. As a young immigrant watching American life from behind a hot dog cart, he knew how precarious power could be. A single inspector, a single landlord, a single cruel customer could crush a small business. In those days, he believed that success meant never again being at someone else's mercy. Over the years, as he gained leverage, he slowly became the kind of figure he had once feared. Someone whose word could dramatically alter another person's fortunes. The turning point between survival instinct and criminal indulgence is hard to pinpoint. Perhaps it came when he realized that the cash from drugs passing through his clubs outpaced everything from drink sales, that there was more money to be made supplying what people quietly demanded than anything else. Perhaps it came the morning he stood in his ransacked living room after the robbery, bruised and shaken, anger trumping caution. Perhaps it came even earlier, when he decided that paying for inside information or cutting corners on taxes wasn't corruption, just smart business. However it unfolded, by the time federal agents assembled their RICO case, his path was clear. He had become what the law calls an organizer. Someone who didn't just participate in crime, but coordinated it. Benefiting from a structure that involved many others, staff, suppliers, enforcers, and corrupted insiders. When he finally stood in court and acknowledged part of that structure, that admission carried weight precisely because it confirmed what so many had suspected for so long, that the outward respectability of restaurants and clubs had hidden a much darker engine. Yet his story is more than a catalog of his own choices. It's also a mirror of the city that allowed those choices to flourish. Los Angeles in his era was hungry for fame, for new sounds, for escapes from ordinary days. Regulations often lag behind reality. Demand for nightlife outpaced the will to monitor it. Drug use cut across social lines, from low-budget apartment parties to Bel Air mansions. In that environment, someone with his skills could thrive for years before the system collected itself enough to push back effectively. The Wonderland episode, and the long struggle to address it in court, became a kind of breaking point. It forced the city to confront how closely entertainment, narcotics, and violence had become intertwined. It also exposed weaknesses in the justice system. How easily witnesses tied to drugs and crime could be discredited or silenced. How vulnerable jurors could be to quiet approaches. How determined defendants with money and connections could drag proceedings out until evidence grew stale. In response, slowly but surely, practices changed. Jurors in major trials began receiving more structured protection and clearer warnings about outside contact. Internal affairs units looked more sharply at officers' relationships with powerful business owners. Licensing boards scrutinized nightclub applications and renewals with fresh attention, asking harder questions about who really controlled certain properties and where their capital came from. None of these adjustments were solely a reaction to him, but his saga pushed them along. For the people whose lives permanently intersected with his choices, the consequences were more personal than procedural. The surviving victim from the Wonderland house carried both physical and emotional scars until her own death. Families of those killed there built lives around absence, marking anniversaries not with candlelit dinners but with visits to quiet plots and boxes of old photographs. Former employees fought their own battles with addiction, haunted by memories of lines laid out on club mirrors or powders passed across bar counters. Drugs they now understood had flowed through chains he helped build. There were also those who, despite everything, remembered him with a measure of conflicted affection. A cook who had arrived penniless from another country and gotten his start in one of Eddie's kitchens. A musician who'd been given a break on a midweek bill and met their future bandmates in that cramped dressing room. A staff member who remembered seeing him slip money to a dishwasher facing eviction. These fragmentary kindnesses sat uneasily beside the far larger harms, illustrating how easy it can be to excuse or overlook the broader damage caused by someone who occasionally behaves generously in private. In the end, how one holds all of that together: early hustle, nightly glamour, drug fortunes, bribed jurors, contested murders. Lady Life frailty says as much about the viewer as about him. Some prefer clear lines: villain or victim, criminal or businessman. His life resists that kind of simple division. He began as a striver in a foreign land and became, through successive choices, a man whose finances and freedom depended on illegal trades and corrupted systems. That transformation didn't erase his early hardships or small acts of decency. It engulfed them. If there is a lesson tucked inside his story, it may be this: environments of rapid opportunity and weak oversight will always attract people willing to stretch rules. Some will stop when they sense a line. Others, like him, will keep walking until nothing is left but lines they plan to buy their way around. The short-term rewards of that approach, money, status, apparent untouchability, can look impressive. But the long tail can be punishing, not just for the one who walks it, but for everyone swept into his orbit. Today, if you step into a modern club in Los Angeles, and the bouncer shines a flashlight into bags, if cameras watch the bar, if management calls police quickly at the first sign of serious trouble, part of the reason is history. The memory of an era when such caution was rare, and of figures like him who exploited that gap. And somewhere, in an aging detective's box of files, in a former server's old badge, in a family stack of clippings about Wonderland, his name is still written, not as a legend to be admired, but as a reminder. A reminder that behind the glitter of nightlife and the glamour of ambitious cities, there are always choices being made in quiet offices and back rooms. Choices about what will be sold, what will be tolerated, who will be protected, and who will be left to bear the cost. The old man who once sat alone in his small house, television flickering over faded photographs, is gone now. The clubs he built have vanished, or been remade. The people who feared or followed him grow fewer with each passing year. But the pattern of his life, the rise from nothing, the turn toward deeper crime, the long, uneven pursuit of accountability remains woven into the story of Los Angeles. If you listen carefully as the city settles at night, under the distant rumble of traffic and the faint echo of music from some current hotspot, you can almost hear another, older rhythm. The echo of those years when one man's restless drive helped fill the nights with light and sound and danger. His story, with all its twists and its unresolved questions, now lives where such stories finally rest in the quiet space between official records and the memories of those who were there. A caution whispered to anyone who thinks they can build an empire on shadows and never have to face the dawn. And as the night settles once more over the silent empires, the echoes of Eddie Nash's world fade back into the shadows, a reminder that some power is never loud, never flashy, just quietly absolute. If you made it this far, you're the heartbeat that keeps these stories alive. Before you drift off, drop your city and the time you're listening in the comments. I always love seeing where these midnight tales travel. And if you enjoyed this journey, Make sure to like the video and subscribe so you never miss another whispered story from the underworld. Sleep well, stay safe, and let the quiet guide you into the dark.